If you've been diagnosed with colorectal cancer, then this video is for you. This was my story of my diagnosis, my treatment, and my recovery. My hope is that this video will help you understand what to expect going forward, and maybe give you some ideas on how you can help minimize the effects and how to recover from this disease. So let's start with, I'm 65 years old, and at 64, less than a year ago, I was diagnosed with stage 3 colorectal cancer. My first symptoms came probably several years ago when I started experiencing some discomfort in my lower abdomen. I'm not a guy who normally goes to the doctor, but at that time this discomfort had persisted for quite some time, so I did go to a doctor, and we just kind of wrote it off as we decided that probably it was just diverticulitis. So we treated that with antibiotics and just went on about life. The symptoms didn't ever really go away, but I just kind of learned to live with them, and they didn't really affect my lifestyle that much. At that point in my life, I had started competing in Spartan races, so I was pretty healthy, and I have my whole life have been somewhat involved in fitness and health, and I kind of felt like I was more or less bulletproof, and the likelihood of me having any kind of serious disease was just not very great. And like everybody, after you turn 40, you know, it was often suggested to me to get a colonoscopy, and I just never did do it. So my first big point in all of this is, if you're over 40, get a colonoscopy. It's not a big deal to do it, and it could save you a lot of the crap that I've had to go through because I didn't do it. So like I said, my symptoms were some discomfort in my lower abdomen, and occasionally I would have blood in the toilet after I used the bathroom. But it wasn't a regular thing, and even that we just thought, well, you know, I lift heavy weights and things, maybe it's just a hemorrhoid, an internal hemorrhoid or something, and it would go away. And it did go away. It came and went. It wasn't a constant thing. But long story short, I finally, at 64, I was a month or so out from competing in a Spartan race with my sons, and I decided to go ahead and get a colonoscopy. I just had a routine physical, which I hadn't had in a few years, and the doctor again suggested that I get a colonoscopy, and I said, you know, maybe I should just go ahead and do it. So I did it. And of course I went in there expecting really nothing to happen. It was just going to be a routine examination. Well, we went through the process, and I'm in the recovery room. They knock you out when they do that, and when I woke up, the doctor was pretty quickly came in, and he didn't mince any words. He just came in and he said, well, you have cancer. Of course, I was shocked, and then he proceeded to show me the pictures of the tumor that I had that was in my sigmoid colon. It was big enough that it pretty significantly blocked my colon. And if I'd have been more aware, I would have realized that even my bowel habits had changed over the years to where I had to go more times in a day than I probably should have. So that was the start of the diagnostic process. So we knew that I had cancer. They didn't even need to do a biopsy. It was obvious that I had cancer. I had a few polyps in there, which they removed, but there was a big tumor in there. So they followed that up immediately with CT scans and determined that there was also a likelihood that the cancer was also potentially in at least some localized lymph nodes. And that's what the whole staging thing takes you to. It's stage 3, it's no longer just local, it's gone into your lymph nodes more than likely. And then stage 4 would be that it's gone into other organs in your body. Now, thankfully, I was at stage 3. So at that point, it was pretty much critical that we get something going to start treating this problem. I still was about a month out from a Spartan race that I was going to run, and I didn't want to interrupt that, so I went through that process. So I went ahead and did the race, and it was a good race, had a great time. But then immediately after that, we began the process of treatment. So the treatment was something that needed to be determined. What was the best way to treat this so that I would have the best outcome? And so involved in that decision process is an oncologist and a surgeon. And then there's a board of in my particular location, there's also a board of cancer specialists who've seen lots of different cases, and they all can chime in and have an opinion on what your particular case is and what the best way forward is for you. So after meeting with the oncologist, the surgeon, and letting them meet as a board and determining what the best thing for me to do, they determined that the best thing for me was to undergo chemotherapy to try and reduce the size of the tumor, particularly because it was so close to the rectal area. And let's maybe describe the whole colon. If you don't know about your colon, it starts at the anus, then the first section of the colon is called the rectum, the next section is called the sigmoid, and then it goes from there. My particular cancer was in the sigmoid colon, but it was right at the basically the line between what they consider the sigmoid and the rectal area of your colon. So there's some differences in the way they treat rectal cancer versus colon cancer. So this one was just called colorectal cancer, and again, I think the biggest thing was they wanted to shrink the tumor to make sure that to give it the best chance of a surgical intervention resulting in a good outcome. So then the next step was they installed a port in my chest. So that port has since been removed, but you can see the scar here where that was. And basically they put a device in your body that makes it easy for them to inject the chemicals, the poisons that they're going to inject for chemotherapy, and also to do blood tests, so you're not just constantly getting new needles shoved into your arm. You just have one place that it goes in, and it's relatively easy for them to work with. So in my case, they decided on, I believe it was 6 rounds of chemotherapy. So the way that went down was I would go in on a Monday, they would plug in a needle to the port, and through that they would begin the process of putting the chemotherapy into my body. It generally took about 2.5 hours from the time they plugged it in. Before they did it, they did blood tests every day to see what your white cell count was and what my body was doing. Basically, to make sure that I was strong enough to handle the effects of the chemotherapy. The chemotherapy is essentially designed to kill the cancer, but in the process of killing the cancer, as much as they want to target just the cancer, it doesn't just target just the cancer, it affects your entire body. So each time before they did it, they would check my blood. They would run a blood test to make sure that that I was strong enough to handle the effects of this chemotherapy. So roughly 2 hours of injecting a couple of bags of nasty chemicals into my body. And these chemicals are so nasty that the people that are installing that in your body are wearing basically chemical suits so that they don't get any of it. If they do get any of it spilled on them, it doesn't impact them, because you don't even want to get it on your skin, but it's going in your body. So it's pretty nasty stuff. And then at the end of that treatment, they left the needle in there. Basically, they gave me a fanny pack with a bag of additional chemicals, and so I had a fanny pack with a bag and a tube running up to this port, and for 2 days after the treatment, that would continuously inject into your body. So you had to sleep with this on. You're stuck with that on. Now throughout all of this, again, I was in pretty good physical condition, basically competing in races and working out with weights, everything, really in pretty good shape. And I really was concerned that I was gonna lose weight and lose all my muscle mass during this treatment time. So throughout the process, in spite of the effects of the chemotherapy, I went ahead and continued to work out. And I also ate a lot more than I normally would, or tried to eat a lot more than I normally would, in order to prevent weight loss. The biggest side effects that I endured from the chemotherapy was, number one was, they call it neuropathy, but the tingling in my hands and in my feet. and the sensitivity to cold. I couldn't take something out of the refrigerator without wearing oven mitts because it hurt. My fingers hurt, they tingled. It was just very, very uncomfortable. That was probably the single biggest side effect. There was some nausea. They give you anti-nausea medication. I only actually had to take that one time. The very first time I got the chemotherapy made me nauseous after about a day. And then of course just weakness. You don't have the energy. I mean, your body's basically trying to deal with poison in your body, so it does take you down. So even though I was able to exercise, the workouts were abbreviated, and the amount of weight I could lift, the distance I could go, all of those things dramatically decreased during this chemotherapy process. Now thankfully I didn't have any radiation, so I can't really talk about the effects of radiation, but that is one of the treatments depending on the location and the size and the type of cancer you have and the size of the tumor. But I didn't have any radiation, so I don't know what that would have done more or less to me, but that was an additional option that they considered, but they first wanted to see if the chemotherapy would reduce the tumor size. Thankfully, the chemotherapy did reduce the tumor size. So after the 6 weeks of chemotherapy, and additionally, so I would get the chemotherapy starting on a Monday, and by Wednesday they would take the device off me, and then I would have a week, I would complete that week and the following week before they would do it over. So it was about a 2-week cycle before the next dose of chemotherapy. So it takes a while to get through that. It's a couple of months process to get through the chemotherapy, maybe more. And I guess I'd like to talk about mentally what this does to you. I think a lot of people could be very adversely impacted by learning that they have cancer, because I mean, cancer, let's face it, it's a scary thing, and somebody comes and tells you have it. It's really scary. But in my case, I guess I've always been a pretty positive guy, a positive thinker. Always looked as the glass is half full, not half empty. And I also considered the fact that the condition that I was in, probably that this was maybe going to be just a bump in the road, and I was going to get over it. So I really didn't suffer depression or anxiety or any of those kinds of things. It was more of just suffering a nuisance. This is something I certainly wouldn't wish on anyone. I didn't want to go through it, but I just knew it was like going in for a grueling workout. It's something you don't really want to do it, but you got to do it if you want to get better on the other side of it. So that's the way I approach this. This is just going to be like going through probably the most difficult workout I've ever done, and on the other side of this, I'm going to be better for having gone through it. The chemotherapy was completed, and it was determined that the tumor size had shrunk by somewhere around 25-26%, which was adequate. They wanted at least to see a 20% reduction before surgery, so we met the criteria, and so the next thing was surgery. That happened fairly quickly. I believe the chemotherapy ended in September, and in October, early October, and I think it was October 11th, I went in for surgery. And that surgery was that they removed my entire sigmoid colon, the whole section of it, and they also removed all of the lymph nodes that were in that general area, and there's a bunch of blood vessels. There's just a whole lot of. So they took a pretty good chunk of my guts out. Now, surprisingly, they were able to do that laparoscopically through a number of incisions on my stomach. So there's some small scars from those, and there was one fairly long scar at the bottom of my abdomen that was apparently where they took the guts out. So within 2 weeks of the surgery, I was again trying to work out. I really was very nervous about lifting anything heavy, and of course the doctors said absolutely do not lift anything heavy. They don't want to have a hernia happen or stitches come undone in where they sewed the colon back together or any of that kind of thing. So it's not the kind of thing you want to screw around with or be extra manly about. So I took a little bit of time to let things heal up before I started doing anything crazy. But within 2 weeks, I was beginning to do some light workouts and start pushing myself trying to get back some of the strength that I'd lost during this whole process. And I got to tell you, I was really, I guess I really wasn't shocked, but it was pretty humbling to realize just how weak I had gotten. In fact, the first time I tried to do a run, I'm not a big runner, but I run enough to be able to do these competitions. And the first time I tried to do a run, I couldn't even make it a quarter of the way around the block where I live. So that was pretty shocking. I mean, I had no wind and I had no strength. Maybe before I go any further, I want to talk a little bit about potentially why I got cancer in the first place. I mean, cancer is the result of something going wrong in one of your cells. It can no longer repair itself. And the cancer itself is just the abnormal reproduction of cells, just cells growing out of control. There's a lot of things that can cause cancer, environmental things, genetic things. The cancer is on the rise, particularly even colorectal cancer is on the rise in America. I think now that the numbers are in people over let's say 55, 60 years old, there's some 30 to 40,000 cases every year, and about 13 to 14,000 of those result in death. But it goes all the way down to people from 0 to 30. There's somewhere around 15, 20,000 of those every year. So it's something, that rate of cancer is on the rise in the world, in America, and I strongly believe that it has to do with our diet more than anything else, what we take into our bodies. And I guess I could go a little further and say it's diet and lifestyle related, probably even more so than genetically related. So in my case, some of the things that might have led to me getting cancer, and let me just say that it's not an instant thing. I don't think that there's very many cases where cancer just like happened overnight and all of a sudden you had this big tumor. It's something that happens gradually over time, and like in my case, the symptoms happened several years before I actually got diagnosed, and so I probably had it then and it just grew. If I'd have dealt with it then, it would have been much less. So maybe one thing to inject here is that if you're 40 years old or older and you haven't had a colonoscopy, get one, because it's not a big deal and it could certainly save you some of the misery that I just went through. But anyway, going back to the lifestyle things, for me, I started chewing smokeless tobacco when I was probably 10 or 11 years old, and I did that habit got to a point where I chewed a lot. I mean, I was if I found myself without a can of Copenhagen, I would get I would panic. So I don't know if I was chewing a can a day, but it was probably pretty close to that, maybe every 2 days. And I did that from the time I was 10 or 11 years old until I was 35 years old. And when I was 35, I had 2 young children at that time, two baby boys, and I decided that I wanted to be around for them, so this was a habit that was probably going to ultimately result in something bad, so I quit. I just quit cold turkey on a New Year's when I was 35 years old. Besides that, and even though I was doing that, I was involved in fitness and health to the point I even owned my own gym when I was in my 20s. So again, I kind of felt like I was bulletproof. I was very strong, very fit, and took care of myself. But one of the things I didn't do is really concern myself that much about what I ate. In fact, I ate way more than most people ate because I was always trying to build muscle, and so I was taking in more calories than most people would. And I didn't have a lot of regard to what it was that I was eating. I didn't think about, the chemicals. I didn't think about the sugars. I just ate everything that wasn't tied down, and I didn't get fat doing that. I just was able to build muscle. So with basically utter disregard to healthy food, it was just all about the calories for me. And then in addition to that, in my youth, until I was in my mid-30s. I didn't drink. I didn't consume alcohol. I did when I was a kid, when I was in my teens. It was a big deal, you know, to go out and party and stuff. But at some point fairly early on, maybe by the time I was 18 or 19, I got into lifting weights, and drinking and drugs just didn't really fit the program. So I just didn't do them. None at all, total zero. I just did not drink or do any drugs. But somewhere around the time I was 35 or so, I was a successful businessman by then, and you know, entertaining clients, etc. You'd go out for cocktails or dinners, and so it started me down a path of where I did drink more than occasionally. And going through the early 2000s, in 2008 in particular, I had a very successful business that lost half its business in 2008, and I started drinking pretty heavily about then. I'm not saying that as an excuse, it's just what I did. And I did that for a number of years. I went through a couple of different businesses at that time that were successes and failures, and just going through all of that, there's a lot of stress involved, and I turned to alcohol as a way to relieve stress. Not a good idea. I think alcohol has been shown now to be something that can certainly lead to cancer. So that may have been another major factor in me getting cancer. I think maybe the moral to that story is, even with all that going on, I had quit the smokeless tobacco, was doing the drinking, and even throughout the time where I did drink alcohol, I competed in martial arts. I regularly lifted weights, but there finally came a point, probably around 50, where I'd had a pretty significant business failure, and I was just kind of done. I'd been working 7 days a week on businesses for so many years that I just kind of was done, and I was done with everything. I just didn't really pay that much attention to my health anymore. Maybe lifted weights occasionally, but I actually got pretty fat, looked terrible, and was generally unhealthy. And then at some point, at about in my early 50s, mid 50s, I decided to turn that around, and that's when I started with my sons. We all decided collectively to start competing in Spartan races, and so we all started getting more healthy. But by then, probably the damage was already done, and I already had cancer, and I just didn't know it. So the moral of that story, I guess, is that don't fool yourself just because you feel physically fit. It's worth getting regular checkups to make sure that you don't have a problem. And it's also worth looking at your whole life, look at all of the things that you do that contribute to your health and fitness, and evaluating whether the things that you're doing might have a potential effect on you that's like colorectal cancer, that's unpleasant. So now here we are, almost 5 months after the surgery, and I've been working out hard for the last 4 of those 5 months, really, and getting back to where now I'm back to where my bench press is kind of back to what it once was, and my squats, my ability to run. I'm now running, 3 miles or so. It's still not great, but it's a tremendous improvement from where I was after the end of the surgery. The long-term side effects that I have, still, I really feel like I don't recover as quickly even from my workouts as I did before this happened. My blood tests, which now there's going to be the continuing ongoing treatment, is regular evaluations, regular CT scans to see that it doesn't recur, and just regular checkups to make sure that everything's gone according to plan. But at this point, I feel like maybe I've beaten this thing, and maybe I no longer have cancer. So those side effects, I still have the tingling in my fingers, still have the tingling in my feet. Nowhere near what it was at the height of it. It's just a minor nuisance at this point. But I think that having a positive attitude going through the whole process and not letting yourself get down is probably a big factor in being able to beat this thing. I also think that getting back on the horse as soon as you can if you go through this and you have surgery, that just laying around and letting yourself deteriorate even further is probably not a good way to go. And you know, as an example, I have a father who's in his mid 80s, and he was, up until about a year or so ago, he was still driving a car, walking around, getting around just fine. I mean, he was diminished somewhat at his age, but he got sick with what turned out to be a urinary problem, and so he was hospitalized for, I don't know, for a short period of time, but during that period of time, he stopped doing everything. He stopped walking around, and he very quickly declined, and so now, and when he did that, instead of trying to build himself back up, he just did less and did less and did less, and it was just a domino effect, and now he's at this point where he's barely able to get up and down out of a chair. And there's no reason for that to be the case, except that he hasn't been willing to push himself to try and build some strength back. It's just where he's at in life. So I guess to summarize all of this, just because you get diagnosed with cancer doesn't mean it's time to throw in the towel. But it is time to start evaluating all of the choices that you make on a day-to-day basis that impact your health and fitness. And it's time, if you have it, it's time to not just cave in and curl up in a ball, but it's time to, I think, get strong, get maybe even stronger than you've been in the past, and understand that you can get through this and you can get back to where you were before it all started. But it's going to take effort. It's not going to happen by itself. You're going to have to challenge yourself to do things physically and to do a better job of of taking care of your diet as well. My plan at this point is, I have a race coming up in about 2 months. I'm going to run Bloomsday in Spokane, Washington. It's about a 7-mile, give or take, race that happens every year. Pretty big. A lot of people from all over the world come to run this race. But I'm going to run that race with my boys. I've never ran that race before. Like I said, I don't really like running, but I'm going to do that one just because. And then about a month and a half after that, I've got 3 Spartan races in one weekend that I'm going to run. And I hope to do those races all over the world for many years to come. And I hope that you got some value from this video, and that maybe it helps you get through whatever you're going through when it comes to your journey with colorectal cancer, or any other cancer for that matter, or any other health problem that you've encountered in your life. If you did get value from this, please share it with somebody else. And I appreciate everyone who watches my videos. Please subscribe, and thanks again.